and welcome. I'm Kira, and baking at 11 p.m. is the norm for me. So if you are here to make gluten-free sourdough banana muffins like I am for breakfast in the morning, then you are in the right place. But in all seriousness, I am a mom who is very busy with 3 boys. And sometimes this is the only time of day that I can get my baking in. So let's do it together.
My children are huge fans of banana muffins. They actually make them with me often, and it is one of their favorite things to have for breakfast and a great way to use some of my sourdough starter. So I typically begin by getting all of my ingredients out, and I will even make large batches of these often because they freeze so well that I can put a whole dozen of them in the freezer and pull them out later in the week. So let's jump right into it. I start off by adding 3 ripe bananas to this, and today I'm actually making a double batch. So I will give you the instructions for making a single batch, which would be a dozen muffins. But if you'd like to do like I do and make a double because you have enough pans, it also works super well to do that because, like I said, you can just take them and put them in the freezer. And then whenever you're ready to eat them, I typically will pull them out the night before and let them thaw in the fridge, and they will be great for breakfast. Later in this recipe, you will need 1/4 cup of melted salted butter. So typically before I get started, I will put that butter into a pot to start melting or into our little toaster oven in an oven-safe container, something to get it melted. You want to put your whisk attachment onto a KitchenAid, or if you're doing it by hand, you just mash all of those bananas up. So for me, it's simpler to just make everything in one pot. I throw my 3 bananas in there, turn on my KitchenAid until everything is nice and blended up so that you don't have too thick of chunks of bananas left. This is my go-to recipe when I realize we have a bunch of ripe bananas that need used up. But if I also have ripe bananas that are starting to turn brown, you can throw them into your freezer and pull them out at a later date. Let them thaw a little bit and they will work just as well in this recipe. So the next thing that I'm going to do is add what would be egg. I have a child that has an egg sensitivity, so I use the Bob's Red Mill egg substitute. But if you would like to use regular eggs, then you would put 2 eggs at this time, or you can use an egg substitute like I am here. I have made it both ways, but like I said, since one of my kiddos cannot do eggs very frequently, we really like the Bob's Red Mill egg substitute. You just put a little bit of the powder that has starches into a cup, mix it with water, and let it sit for a couple minutes, and then you'll be able to dump it in once it starts to thicken up. While I wait for that mixture to thicken, I usually grab the vanilla and put a teaspoon of vanilla into the bowl. You are more than welcome to use measuring spoons, but I do not like dirty dishes, so I eyeball it. After the vanilla, I add 1/4 cup of olive oil, as well as 1/4 cup of maple syrup. And like I said, you can easily double all of this like I am doing, and then you will be able to make 2 dozen muffins instead of 1. If you have already put your eggs in, then you are good to go. But if you are like me, I continuously go back and check that egg substitute to see if it has started to thicken up. I believe the bag says a couple of minutes, but you can usually tell because like the bread that I make and I mix it up and the psyllium husk thickens, it will be obvious that the egg substitute will have a little bit of thickness to it, and then you will be able to tell that it is ready to put in. So I highly recommend that if you have someone in your family that has an egg sensitivity. If you've been following along on my sourdough journey for a while now, I usually keep my starter in a pretty large container because I use a lot of it. But in this instance, I wanted to feed my starter, but also keep some extra to use as discard because I knew I wanted to make these muffins tonight. So I took some of the starter out and put it in a container, and that's what I am using here. So I'm going to add 1/2 cup of sourdough discard, You see me here doubling that since I'm making those 2 dozen muffins instead of 1. I kept this discard in the fridge in this little measuring cup with a beeswax wrap on top of it, and the wax wrap worked super well and kept everything nice and contained. So I highly recommend that if you're looking for a way to store some extra starter until you can use it later in the day. So by this point, my egg substitute had thickened enough that I was feeling good about it, so I added that in. I also pulled that 1/4 cup of butter out of the toaster oven and let it sit to cool for 3 to 4 minutes so that it was not flaming hot when I went to dump it in. This was what we were melting earlier on. And by this point, you have now added all of your wet ingredients. So it is time to get your whisk out and get to work, or in my case, the trusty KitchenAid is going to get to work for me. I let everything mix up for just a few minutes until you can see all of that butter get incorporated into it. It's pretty obvious whenever everything's mixed up. There will be slight clumps in it, and that is just from the banana. But once you can tell that all of that butter is incorporated in very well, then it is time to mix our dry ingredients in. This is one of my favorite recipes because you can make it all in one container. Aside from melting the butter, it does not require a bunch of extra bowls. However, despite not wanting to use the measuring spoons earlier, I will use them when it comes to baking powder because it is a little more precise. So at this point, I am adding a 1/2 tablespoon of baking powder. And if you would like to make these cinnamon banana muffins, I also will usually add in 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. But my boys really love cinnamon, which means we go through it really quickly, and on this particular day, did not have any left in our house. So after you add that 1/2 tablespoon of baking powder, give everything a really nice good mix. You want to make sure that you don't have clumps of baking powder stuck in the middle of your wet mixture. And then you will pull out, last but not least, your gluten-free flour. I use King Arthur's gluten-free measure for measure flour in all of my gluten-free baking, almost exclusively. I like it a lot because it's very accessible to me. My local stores sell it. It does not have xanthan gum in it, which I prefer, and it seems to yield some of the best results that I've found out of all of the different gluten-free flour blends that I've tried. So just keep in mind that if you're using a different blend of gluten-free flour, some will be a little heavier than others. So at this point, I have added in 1 cup of the gluten-free measure for measure flour and started the mixer up again. You will want to give everything a very good mix. Stop your mixer, lift it up, scrape down all of your sides really well to make sure you get all of the flour that is around the edges of the bowl, as well as all of the flour that is underneath, to make sure that there is no clumps of flour and no clumps of baking powder left in your bowl. I do this when I am baking bread, and it is just as important when you are baking any baked goods, for instance, muffins today. This is generally about the point that when I am making muffins during the daytime, my little boys that are helping begin to ask if they are going to get to lick the bowl. So it was a surprisingly peaceful and quiet night in my house, making muffins by myself without my little helpers at my side. I have sped things up pretty fast here, as you can tell, so that you do not have to just sit here and stare at my mixer doing its job. However, once I have added the flour and all of the ingredients, I typically will let that mixer run for a good 2 to 3 minutes to get everything extremely well incorporated. So don't be afraid to turn it on and let it sit there a while. If you want to make this by hand, you can also do that, and I have before, but you will be whisking. Your hand will be feeling it after a few minutes. Your batter should look a little something like this. It should not be overly runny, and it should not be crazy clumpy, but you can still see those banana clumps in there. and you can go ahead and set your oven to 375 degrees. It typically does not take very long to heat up, which is why I wait until this point to start preheating my oven. And then for the fun part, I start scooping the batter right into my reusable muffin cups. I think that's what they're called. I love these reusable muffin holders. I use them for banana muffins, and I also use them for pizza cups or any other sort of thing that I'm making in muffin tins. They get so much use, and my children also love to stack them, so they double as a toy when they're not being used for cooking and then have to get cleaned in between. But you want to do one heaping spoonful, and to be honest, this was the moment that I realized I wasn't sure how great I was at measuring things out and was a little afraid that I would be videoing and showing you how to scoop all of these muffins into the tin and get down to the very last one and not have any left. But no need to fear, I am indeed making 2 dozen muffins. In your case, it would be 1 dozen with the recipe unless you are doubling it. And once your oven is preheated, you pop them in. Let them stay in there for 15 to 18 minutes. I usually check on them around 15 minutes. Take a toothpick, poke it in. Make sure that you don't have anything super gooey coming out. If you do, give them another 1 to 2 minutes. And then you are all set for a midnight banana muffin taste test. I grabbed them out first thing in the morning, and because my children had no idea that I was making them while they were sleeping, they were so ecstatic. So I hope you enjoy them just as much as they did.